For hosting this committee. And I want to focus a little bit on perhaps the unintended consequences of some of our Russia and Ukraine policy of the last year. And I direct my question to you, Ms. Rosenberg, and thank you all for being here. So I've known this committee before. Our sanctions policy in Russia has been a complete and total failure. We thought that we would shrink the Russian economy by 10, 20, 30, even 50%, yet we've shrunk the Russian economy by very little. And if you compare it to the performance of other regional economies, and let's say in terms of the performance of its currency, it's actually doing pretty well relative to other world currencies. So the foreign policy establishment claimed that one of the strongest sanctions measures was the disconnection of Russian banks from SWIFT. Scholars claim that this would kneecap the Russian economy, but while the Washington foreign policy establishment was preoccupied with crafting a sanctions regime, they failed to consider that Russia had been developing their own alternative to SWIFT, which is, of course, the SPFS. Ms. Rosenberg, I want to ask first, has the SPFS grown in response to being cut off from SWIFT, and by how much has it grown?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. We are aware of and looking at the Russian payments rails system, if you will, the SPFS, which grew significantly earlier on in the prior stage of Russia sanctions in 2014, when it saw some of the writing on the wall about its inability to access certain international financial institutions or partners, and began developing at that time.
Yeah, so my understanding, at least the Russian claims, are that they've integrated about 50 foreign banks just in the last couple of years onto the SPFS system. And to your point, it sounds like they integrated a lot more before, from maybe 2014 to 2020, perhaps 2021. The other really concerning thing, of course, is that India and Iran seem to be getting closer and closer to the Russian financial system, even as they're getting further and further away from the American financial system. And in particular, India, which we should all recognize is the most important geopolitical counterweight to China in the region. It's a very bad thing for them to be getting closer to Russia and China and the Russian financial system. Just for my edification and anybody else who's listening, could you speak a little bit to the national security importance? So what do we get out of cooperative organizations like SWIFT as the dominant global bank power, and what kind of access does our law enforcement have that they wouldn't have if you had major foreign powers shifting off of SWIFT?
Thank you for the question. I have also noted with great concern some of the developments and expanding efforts by Russia with several specific partners to have direct and bilateral financial flows. You mentioned India and Iran. Those are not the only ones. There are other countries where this is a great concern. And as you pointed out, this is designed to be an effort to relieve and mitigate its dependency on international financial systems. So the reason why Russia, as we see it, is seeking to do this is because it has less and less connectivity with international financial architecture. It's not just SWIFT, it's also the correspondent banking relationships that have been cut off so significantly by the European and US and British sanctions that have severed a designated number of banks and severed those relationships. But the concern that I hear you expressing is concern we also have. We cannot rest knowing that we have designated over 80% of Russia's financial system and restricted their access to SWIFT systems. That is insufficient if they are still able to move around them and gain access to international financial channels.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and certainly agree with the emphasis there. My concern, I guess, is that our Ukraine policy has had this massive unintended consequence. And if we had gone into this 18 months ago knowing that we would maybe be pushing India closer to the Chinese, not to say nothing of Russia, we're pushing Russia and India closer to the Chinese. We're encouraging the creation of an entirely alternative financial system. It's really important that our law enforcement has access to some of these financial transactions. It's one of the ways we catch international crime. It's one of the ways that we prevent international terrorism. If the consequence of our Ukraine policy is weakening that financial system and strengthening an alternative financial system, I think it's one of the many consequences for our country that our policymakers haven't fully incorporated, and frankly, that the American people are not fully aware of, because you don't see the effects of this stuff right away. We may be dealing with consequences for years or even decades to come. But I appreciate your work on this and appreciate your answer to the questions. Thank you, Ms. Rosenberg, and thanks to everybody else. I yield.
Thank you, Senator Vance. Senator Warren of Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Fentanyl is fueling the most severe drug crisis our country